You don't run out of money all at once. It happens quietly. First, it's a small expense you didn't plan for. A phone repair, a medical bill, a late fee. Then you shift things around, delay something, borrow a little. Then something else breaks. And suddenly, you're not managing money anymore, you're reacting to it. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most people aren't one bad decision away from financial stress. They're one normal day away from it. Right now, millions of people are being told the same advice. Build an emergency fund. Save 3 to 6 months of expenses. It sounds simple, responsible, almost obvious. But there's a problem no one talks about. That advice quietly assumes you already have extra money. And if you're living on a low income, that assumption breaks everything. Because when your income barely covers your life, just save more isn't a strategy. It's a contradiction. So the real question isn't how much you should save. The real question is, how do you build an emergency fund when your financial system is already stretched to the edge? Let's start with how the system actually works. Most financial advice is built around stability, stable income, predictable expenses, a small surplus. But low-income reality is the opposite. Income fluctuates, expenses surprise you, and the margin for error is basically zero. So instead of a smooth system, you get something more fragile. A chain reaction. One unexpected cost forces a compromise. That compromise creates another cost later. And over time, small problems compound into bigger ones. Not because of bad decisions, because the system leaves no room for anything else. And this is exactly where an emergency fund becomes powerful. Not as a big, perfect savings account, but as a small interruption to that chain reaction. Most people imagine an emergency fund as a number, 3 months, 6 months, a target far in the distance. But that framing is misleading, because when you're starting from zero, the first goal isn't months, it's moments. Can you handle one unexpected expense without breaking everything else? That's the real starting point, and it changes how you approach the entire problem. So instead of asking, how do I save a large amount? You ask a different question. How do I create small pockets of financial control? Because control, not size, is what an emergency fund actually gives you. Step 1 is not saving, it's exposure. You need to know exactly where your system breaks. Not in theory, in reality. Where does your money actually go? Not the ideal version, the real one. For most people, this is where things get uncomfortable. Because the numbers don't just show spending, they show trade-offs. Food versus transport, bills versus flexibility, short-term relief versus long-term stability. And once you see it clearly, something becomes obvious. There isn't a lot of waste. There's just a lack of margin. So instead of cutting everything, the focus shifts. You're not trying to eliminate spending, you're trying to create space. Even a small one. Because in a tight system, a small gap changes everything. Step 2 is micro-buffering. This is where most advice goes wrong. It jumps straight to saving large amounts. But in a constrained system, large goals create pressure. And pressure leads to failure. So instead, you build in layers. Start with the smallest possible buffer. The goal is not to feel secure. The goal is to interrupt the next problem. Maybe it's the cost of one bill, or a small emergency expense. Something specific, something real. Because once that first buffer exists, the system behaves differently. You're no longer forced to react immediately. You have time. And time is what breaks the chain reaction. Here's the uncomfortable math. If you try to save aggressively on a low income, you increase your risk in the short term, because you're pulling money out of a system that's already tight. So if something goes wrong, you're forced to undo your savings, which makes the process feel pointless. This is why so many people start saving, and then stop. Not because they lack discipline, because the system punishes early effort. So instead of aggressive saving, you use controlled accumulation. Slow, consistent, almost boring. Not because it's ideal, but because it survives pressure. Step 3 is separating money from yourself. This sounds simple, but it's one of the most important mechanics. If your emergency fund sits in the same place as your daily money, it's not a fund, it's just delayed spending. Because when pressure hits, accessibility becomes temptation. And temptation wins. So the goal is friction, not extreme friction. Just enough to pause. A separate account, a different app, a slight delay, something that forces you to think before using it. Because an emergency fund only works if it survives your worst days, not your best intentions. Now here's where things get interesting. At a certain point, something subtle shifts. The fund is still small, but your behavior changes. You stop solving problems with urgency. You start solving them with options. And options, even small ones, change outcomes. You avoid late fees. You reduce borrowing. You make slightly better decisions. And over time, those small improvements compound. Not dramatically, quietly. But there's a contradiction at the center of all this. The system that tells you to save is the same system that makes saving difficult. Low wages, rising costs, unpredictable expenses. These aren't accidents. They're structural. Which means an emergency fund isn't just personal finance. It's a form of self-insurance in a system that doesn't provide it. And that's why the usual narrative feels incomplete. Because it treats saving as a habit problem, when in reality, it's a systems problem. You're not just building a fund, you're building resilience against instability. Step 4 is protecting the fund from false emergencies. This is where many people quietly lose progress. Because not every urgent expense is an emergency. Some are predictable, irregular bills, seasonal costs, maintenance. They feel sudden, but they're not unexpected. So if your emergency fund keeps getting used for these, it never grows. The solution isn't stricter discipline, it's categorization. You create a second layer, a buffer for expected surprises, even a small one. Because once those are separated, your true emergency fund becomes stable. And stability is what allows it to grow. Step 5 is redefining the goal. Not 3 to 6 months, not yet. The real milestones look different. Can you handle one emergency without borrowing? Then 2. Then a week of expenses? Each stage changes your risk level. Each stage reduces how fragile your system is. And eventually, without noticing, you reach a point where the idea of months becomes realistic. Not because you aimed for it directly, because you built toward it indirectly. Now compare this to the public narrative. Save aggressively. Cut expenses. Discipline equals success. It sounds clean, logical, efficient, but it ignores how real systems behave under pressure. Because in a constrained environment, efficiency isn't the goal. Survival is. And survival requires flexibility, not perfection. There's also something quietly ironic here. The people who most need an emergency fund are the ones for whom it's hardest to build. And the people who least need it are the ones who can build it fastest. Which tells you something important. This isn't just about money, it's about positioning. Over the long term, this has consequences. Without an emergency fund, every shock pushes you backward. With one, even a small one, shocks become manageable. And that difference compounds over years. It affects debt, stress, opportunities, even the kind of risks you're willing to take. Because when you're constantly exposed, you avoid risk. And when you avoid risk, you limit upside. So a small financial buffer doesn't just protect you. It changes your trajectory. But none of this makes the process easy. Because the hardest part isn't saving money. It's doing it while everything around you is trying to pull that money back out. So in the end, building an emergency fund on a low income isn't about hitting a number. It's about slowly changing how your system reacts to pressure. From fragile to slightly stable to quietly resilient.